look, there's a little column about the planets. When does Venus rise and set and all those things for you stargazers. Mr. Joyce is the contributor to that. So he is a bit of a celebrity around here and happens to be an expert in astronomy and climate as well. So I'm going to turn the stage over to Mr. Joyce. Let us know if you have any difficulty hearing with the rain outside. And his colleague here is filming the program, and at some point in the future this will be available on YouTube. So if anybody wants to see it on YouTube, just let me know at the reference desk and I'll make sure that Mr. Joyce sends me an email and somehow or other we'll get the word out as to when the program's available on YouTube. I know it took a while the last time he was here to do a program, but it's kind of nice to go back and watch it in case you missed something the first time around, because he does have a lot of information to present. So Dan, take it away here. And our first question, he already knows, why are we having this goofy weather this week? What's going on with this craziness? 60 degrees, 19 degrees, ice and rain, and it's just horrible.
Yeah, back and forth. Well, some would say the culprit is a developing La Nina. Maybe you've heard of El Nino. The El Nino happens when there's not much in the way of trade winds, so that the equatorial Pacific it's able to get warmer because it doesn't have any wind pushing the warm water away and allowing upwelling from the northern coast of South America to start to come in. That upwelled water, of course, would be colder. So, but when you have La Nada, you do have a lot of wind coming, so you do get that upwelling. Yeah, in El Nino, there's not enough wind to create that upwelling, but in La Nada, you do. So the Pacific has been going from relatively warm to gradually cooler. And the result is the atmosphere now doesn't know what to do anymore. So it does everything. In a nutshell, you could say that's what's going on, right? So, anyway, science lost out to politics and big money. And that's me. And our date. Now, back about 6 years ago, where I work at Triton College, as I said, CERN Space Center, there was a debate. It was a campus debate, and the topic was resolved: global warming is caused by human activity. Now, the geography department took the affirmative, and I took the negative. And we were each given formats. We had a half-hour presentation, then another 20 minutes for rebuttals, and then the audience was asked to participate and ask questions of us, and we were asked to prepare questions for our opponent. And we only, because of the number of questions the audience had, we only had time for one question each. And I'm going to ask that question, and the rest of tonight I'm going to spend answering it. Yeah. It looks like a simple question. Given the amount of publicity generated by Hurricane Katrina in the record-setting 2005 Atlantic Basin tropical storm season, why was there no attention given to the unprecedented tornado season that same year, despite the anticipated increase in intensity and frequency? Anyone know the answer? Well, I can tell you this much. In the audience that night were two retired lead forecasters from the National Weather Service. And I said, you won't be able to answer this. And they couldn't. It's in several parts here, so please be patient. What's going on here? All right, first time since 92, or except for 92, for the first time since 1875, no fatalities from tornadoes anywhere in the country in the months of April and May. So we've gone a long way without any fatalities. No deaths in June or July of that year either. Okay, almost the entire season goes by without tornado deaths, a span of no fatalities through that period, having no precedent going back to 1854. Yeah. So in the same year as Katrina, and that record-setting hurricane season, there's no tornadoes. In fact, it even gets better. Oklahoma, ever since its inception, back in 1898, always had tornadoes in the month of April. Not in 2005. The only year that never didn't have any. So what's going on in the atmosphere? All those hurricanes, but no tornadoes. And both are supposed to be caused by global warming. And it gets better. No tornado of Fujita force scale 5 for a 6-year interval. It would take 2 more years before another would occur. So the new record goes from 5 years to 8 years between those top-end events. We're hearing about things, oh my God, the tornadoes are going to kill us. There was even a movie called Night of the Twisters. And at the end of it, it has this 5-minute explanation of how they're going to destroy us. You know, well, maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. Now, when nothing happens, that same nothing does not usually make news, does it? Right. Did you hear about the unprecedented tornado season until now? You didn't hear about it? No. Right. Anytime a high-profile weather event happens, the media takes full advantage. Such attachment is then made to these phenomena with the concept of global warming that a significant percentage of the population ends up thinking there must be a close association, and therefore positive reinforcement is going to take place. So what happens when nothing happens? The reciprocal of a big event, that is, nothing happened. Even when it's unprecedented, no such association with a skeptical point of view, because what's never mentioned will never enter the mind to provide any contrary evidence that would require to support doubt. So reinforcement cannot occur. You didn't hear about it, right? You didn't hear about all that lack of, did you? Right. Even in the hurricane season that just passed, in the last several, since 2005, the last 4 years have been near record on a global scale, near record low tropical storm intensity on the overall index, the so-called accumulated cyclone index. Near record low the last several years, even including this year. You hear about Sandy. It's a complete freak. This is a complete freak. There were only 2 mentionable hurricanes the whole season. There were quite a few named tropical storms, although you could dispute a couple of them because they appear to be more from fluid dynamics rather than thermal dynamics. But even the hurricanes themselves are really down. And of course, the East Coast was caught unprepared. Even though 7 years earlier Katrina had hit New Orleans, why not be ready for this? Well, they're still calling for, if you listen to the radio, there's, you know, the ad council is still saying we need help and everything else, because some people still don't have electricity back. This is from October 30th, right? The devastation is very great, but the media is not covering it. Yeah. So, yeah, so you have the low hurricane frequency as well going on right now. So we had a big spike, and of course in 2011 we had a big spike in tornadoes. But guess what? In 2012, since the early 1950s, when the Weather Service began to issue alerts about tornadoes, 2012 was the lowest number of tornadoes since that time. The lowest number. Despite the spike the previous year. So there's no consistency here. All you have are gaps of, okay, fairly long high events, fairly long low events, and spikes, both ways. Doesn't that sound like Mother Nature to you? It does to me. I mean, where's the trend? You need a pattern here. No pattern. Advocates have an inherent advantage by the nature of the beast. There's no such thing as a dramatic non-event to call attention to the fact that skepticism may be valid. There's no dramatic, I mean, you have a nice day. It was a nice day. Well, it doesn't cause you to think, oh, well, maybe skepticism's okay. Or as I say, denial, in fact. That's global warming denial. I don't care whether anybody calls me that, because I know my opponents are in denial of Mother Nature. That's where they're in denial. Okay. So even when there's immediate evidence of dramatic chills, such as record snows, low temperatures, global warming in the amateur press offers as little coverage as possible. It doesn't treat it the way it would a heat wave. Why? Because there's no glamour in nothing happening. There's a lot of glamour in global warming because we can think we are causing it. Okay, the IPCC, famous organization. Preliminary report number 4, back in 2007, notes on page 6 of topic 1 that intensity, location, frequency of smaller scale events, dust storms, lightning, tornadoes, and hail cannot be predicted with climate change. That's exactly what it says. But most people are led to believe otherwise. Why? Because you're not getting that information straight from the text. It goes through some manipulation, shall we say. So when they reach these big events, when they reach headlines, it's so easy for politicians to get a handle on that the combination of the publicity of the event in addition to their pomposity, I'll use the right word, would likely squeeze out any call for checking what is asserted in the very document they so frequently feign that they cite. They're only faking it. And our good friend Al Gore. Let's see if I can conjure him up here. Can I open? Oh no. Try it again. Yeah. What's the matter with your system? Okay, well, all right. I'll just note this fact then if it's not going to show it. I was going to show you what he did on Conan O'Brien back a few months ago. He was talking about global warming with Conan, and he said that the Earth, of course, has a very hot core. It has very hot rock down there, millions of degrees. Millions of degrees. Yeah. Well, now we don't have to worry about saving the planet because now we live on a star. Only a star would have millions of degrees in its core. I mean, they even just a few months ago, he still can't get the science right. I wish darn that would have been able to come up, but obviously it hasn't. All right. Well, anyway, there's our panel. And off to a roaring start. Yeah. Now, Hollywood, that bastion of science and technology. They always get the science right, don't they? That's why they gave Al the Academy Award. They always get it right. Look at that. Ever see that one? That is rated among us scientists as the greatest number of scientific fallacies in any movie. The greatest number. And here's another one of the choice bunch. And there you go. See? They're already experts. Yeah. This one's really neat. Tom Skilling was asked to actually review this movie, and he said, "There's no way I can start. No way I can start. There's nothing correct about it in any way, shape, or form. Nothing. But millions of people saw it, and there we go. See, they're all experts. All right. So concerning that IPCC text, if there was greater awareness among us, the politicians and media would find it prohibitive to exaggerate. So widespread scientific illiteracy enables them to make any sort of correlation. So vast ignorance of what is stated in the actual text of the report protects them from being caught spreading distortions. Scientific illiteracy is basically what's going on. So a departure from what is officially found in the report was bound to happen. Politicians, they're always anxious to draw as much attention to themselves as they can, will try to be as inflammatory as possible with any suggestive statement found in the text. Especially if they find it advantageous to ignore any remedial phrasing concerning the statement. And we're going to get to a good example of that here in a couple of minutes. So the tendency to relate events such as tornadoes to global warming underscores the curious lack of communication between the scientists, the media, and the lawmakers of just what the situation actually is. Who's leading who? Now becomes a question. Okay, here's some examples of politicians, media professionals, pop culture icons Grand Foundation moguls. Now, unlike those guys, scientists must be much more demanding than just taking some statement from any particular document and playing it for what it's worth. But notice, scientists are only 1/4 of that. And who has the money? I can tell you from experience, long and hard, it's not in science, that's for sure. Especially not science education. So many non-scientists have entered the discourse. The result is what is displayed as science is not that in any respect, but rather a form of barely plausible speculative musing, not subject to any discipline at all, except of course to make money, especially from the feds. The statement in the IPCC report asserts that there will be extremes, but pointedly tempers this to mean higher temperatures, melting glaciers, and resultant higher sea level. That's all. Nothing about hurricanes. Nothing about big storms. Nothing like that. No. In fact, when Al Gore had people from some academic institutions at a Senate committee hearing back in 1988. At that time, they were saying that, okay, what's going to happen is it's going to affect more of the polar regions, the high latitudes, and leave the tropics more or less alone. The reason for that was that it was understood that carbon dioxide would not have that much effect going up against the water vapor that exists already in the tropics. So in the drier, higher latitudes, it would have maybe a blanketing effect. So that meant there'd be less contrast across either hemisphere, from the high latitude to the lower latitude. And that meant it would be slower systems, because less contrast means less squeezing, and therefore wind velocity would go down, forcing would go down, you'd have the drought like we had in 1988. And that would continue to happen. Did it continue to happen? Well, we had a big drought last year, 24 years later. But was it persistent? Well, look at what happened tonight. So, the last couple of nights. So, but when you listen to politicians in the media, you think that that's not true. But that is what it says. It's right there in that text. There's so many personalities in the spotlight. They're totally uninhibited in what they say about weather anecdotes as they relate to climate. It suggests either that they do not read or hear the actual text, or they wantonly exaggerate in spite. Also suggests the scientists involved are not relaying their findings to policymakers with any regard as to how much care they should take with the data, as such information may forestall funding for their research. They don't like to hear that, the politicians. The Grant Foundation people, they don't want to hear that. There's too much glamour in global warming. They don't want to hear it. As if such precautions are not being heeded, not being forwarded in the moral. Well, okay. High-profile media professionals, similarly predisposed because the attractive headlines involved. And in many cases, they appear to have a desire to follow those politicians and scientists most willing to sound off about the scariest and most alarming of the hypothesized scenarios. Okay. So they're going to follow them. And those wishing to finance projects that involve atmospheric research also appear to have this predisposition. There's certain glamour about funding something which you can involve policy decisions and policy making in. If nothing was happening, what policies would you come up with? What controlling influences could you start to impose? None. Another problem involving scientists had to do with the assertion at the very beginning, again in the late 1980s, that global warming had a strong likelihood of being true. So what did that mean? So many of them were not familiar with the particulars that rather than appear to question something that may be involved with cataclysmic global consequences, they refrained from expressing any reservations they may have harbored. You don't want to endanger anybody, right? Even more applicable. Politicians and mass media personnel, they in particular would not want to appear as if they're jeopardizing good old planet Earth or the polar bears. They would be the ones most likely to desire to appear heroic in the face of the danger, whether imagined or not. Just watch Scott Pelley or Brian Williams. They're all over it, all the time. And they're the most vocal organs in modern society. It would have been natural for them to compete to see which of them was the first and foremost to demonstrate how much they cared for those who may be victims of some future calamity. Because you can't care the other side. If there's nothing happening, you can't display any caring for people who are not going to be affected. Again, you have that mindset where it favors those who are taking the one side. It doesn't favor somebody saying, well, there's nothing going to happen. You can't appear as if you care. Right. So, it becomes difficult to distinguish where responsibility can be pinned down the most. Could it be the scientists not stating up front and with great emphasis that some explanations in the text have confinements that must be heeded? Or is it politicians either to get publicity at any opportunity? Media has ample incentive to attract more viewership, to impress more advertisers. Nothing happened does not work. Aspiring philanthropists are all too eager to finance something either very interesting or advances a belief in an agenda. In the face of that circumstance, the scientists may be unwilling to try to keep the media and politicians subdued, since so much more funding is coming their way when they're able to convey a sense of foreboding. How do you get it when you say, oh, well, nothing's happening, guys, so, okay, pack it in. That's what they'd be told. Serious impediment from the scientific community when the IPCC was originated at the behest of the UN, which in turn appears to have been under the influence of global governance ideologues. Now, I'm taking a little liberty there from my position as a scientist, but you look at it close, and this is the only conclusion you can draw. I mean, it's not a scientific statement. But then again, you have to start getting suspicious. Lots of birdie. Well, prior to being a consensus or a finding of incontrovertible evidence, I really love that word, the IPCC was just that, dedicated to climate change. It was not about climate study, but rather change, as if it had already been ordained. Yeah. First report, back in 1990, contained information that subsequent authors actually found uncomfortable, because at least some of the original researchers were apparently under the assumption it was going to be an honest investigation. And they put out what they thought had been the climate history of the last 1,000 years. Oh, we can't have that, eventually they found out. I'll explain in a little while why that was the case. Become incumbent upon their successors to cover up some of the original assertions which had been researched and reviewed over and over again for several decades prior, and had always been persuasive in the climate science community. But how big was the climate science community back then? Not very big. In fact, the U.S. has never had any more than 61 people with a PhD in climate science. No more than 61. That's pretty puny. Neither cohesive enough nor of sufficient size to be very effective at the time, we eventually be overwhelmed by the sheer bulk of the climate change organizers. They just were. Financiers would be far more likely to ask researchers to find global warming than to study climate. This appears to be what has happened more frequently as the idea of climate change became more of a high-profile issue in the last couple of decades. Foundations eager to fund climate researchers have been curious about global warming just because it has entered the public spotlight, and therefore they ask the research scientists the wrong question. They ask them, find global warming. Now, see whether it's happening or not. No, find it. That's what's going on. Operated by people anxious to advance political causes, since they are from an elite social hierarchy, they all are, whose constituency consistently demands adherence to a particular political orthodoxy. There's long been a link between certain political ideology and the concept of global warming, especially here in the U.S. I don't know whether you notice it or not, but it's there. As asserted before, there was difficulty in distinguishing whether politicians and media organs are just ignoring warnings from the scientists, or if it is the scientists being concerned about losing their funding and therefore themselves have not been forthcoming. Which is it? Apparently, many people with vested interests and without scientific credentials have communicated with each other in a chaotic and totally undisciplined environment, and have done so to the point of contaminating the discipline of the scientists themselves. This is right at the crux of it. They're contaminating the discipline of the scientists. Difficulty even to conceptualize that such confused discourse could have been underway. Even those intricately involved in the scientific study would be hesitant to question what's been going on and thus not inclined to investigate. You're a little scientist, and you're having to obey all these people with big money. Where are you going to hide? Nowhere. Okay, the investment of enormous resources on the assumption that the scientific consensus is correct, both the time and money, all these resources, by such a broad array of interests, ends up creating an aura that everything about it must be on the level. You got all these people who say it's true, they're spending all this money, they're involving all this time, they're putting people out in the field, they're creating all these new energy sources, which don't work. And it's a problem. Moreover, it may not be that there are so many resources being involved, but also reputation. Who would be putting their prestige on the line unless a high degree of certainty was involved? Well, if they're all that certain, they're certainly not going to admit they were wrong. Now, with all that prestige on the line, the people in such considerable numbers and high-profile status could not possibly put their reputations at risk, nor could those who may have been advising them. Well, so here's where it gets a little juicy. Even if a scientist wishes to convey a degree of uncertainty about how much additional amounts of carbon dioxide affect the atmosphere, by the time it reaches a fifth overeager politician or seventh headline-purveying member of the media, any doubt will have vanished. It's sort of like the description of in an Army manual of the coming of Halley's Comet back in 1910. The original description was, okay, the comet's going to come around, you'll be able to see it for a little while. And in the actual manual, after it came down through all the bureaucracies, was, well, General Halley's Comet is going to be coming on parade, and we better be ready for it, something like that. And it's just, it gets that bad. You have all these people who are undisciplined. It's going to be a consensus, and the science will have been settled. Right. Now, a dramatic example of this motif occurred in 1990 when researchers studying Antarctic ice cores, okay, they dig deep, the cores go down thousands of feet, and they noted temperature variation corresponding with carbon dioxide fluctuation over a several 100,000-year period. Though the coincidence at first appeared virtually one-to-one, the researchers tried in vain to caution against jumping to conclusions. Now, this particular graph was seen in An Inconvenient Truth, that Al Gore Academy Award-winning documentary. Okay, now, but the researchers tried in vain to caution against jumping to conclusions. Tendency to sympathize with those who rush to judgment, since as the temperature appeared to advance and wane with the level of carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, there seemed to be an undeniable cause and effect being demonstrated. So the adherents pounced on this and said, okay, here's proof, convincing proof, conclusive proofs that we have that carbon dioxide levels are the cause of the thermal variation. It would not be until 2003, this is 13 years later, that more advanced analysis of the ice cores revealed that the thermal variation preceded, by an average of 8 centuries, rather than followed the carbon dioxide trends. By that time, of course, it was too late. You had 13 years of this, and it's all muddled. They couldn't just approach them and say, okay, it's wrong. more than enough for adherents to insert into what was becoming a collective mindset the concept that the 1990 graphs revealed a virtual match for the carbon dioxide thermal connection. Of course it's causing it. And CO2 is a greenhouse gas, they would emphasize. Well, by the time the advanced method of analyzing ice cores was enabled, it was far too late to communicate that back to the interested parties. The parties, the media, the politicians, and the grant foundations. How do you twist them around? How do you get that back in the track? They've become far too close-minded to accept an alternative explanation. Thank you. Even before modern techniques were applied to the data at hand, there were a couple of glaring difficulties with the concept of carbon dioxide levels causing temperature fluctuations. The synchronicity of the carbon dioxide thermal correlation suggests strongly that an innate terrestrial mechanism ought to have been found to explain why this is so pronounced in the prehistoric world record. The anthropological global warming adherents have at no time been forthcoming with such a mechanism, and that's because there is none. External cosmic forces are the answer. The only alternative to cosmic force would be that Earth has some sort of spigot planted into it with a time valve to allow the CO2 to increase, forcing temperatures to go up, and an equally mysterious drain, again perfectly timed, which it somehow gets pumped into, allowing the CO2 levels to drop, and with the temperature following along, all happening on 110,000 year long cycle. Where does this drain pour into? Why does it seem to have a time plug release? And is it the same secret chamber or sink, as it would be known, that it gets pumped from when nature deems it proper to warm things up? So it's going to this nice little chamber, it hides there for a while, comes back out again, warms the place up, the glaciers go away, and then somehow it goes back in, and then the glaciers come back. The more watchful scientific editorial staff among the nation's major media organs would not miss such an obvious gap in the arguments of the adherents. And it's a very obvious gap. There are no magic spigots, valves, drains, or hidden chambers with which Earth can regulate CO2 levels, which can then substitutely control atmospheric thermal content. You ever see one on a globe? Oh, there's a little plug. And when it goes out, the carbon dioxide just sinks right in and hides there for a while, and then come back again in that magically timed spigot. It doesn't work that way. The sink would prove to be the oceans, alternately dissolving and releasing CO2, in step with a phenomenon known as Milankovitch forcing. It's an external cosmic effect. Since warmer water tends to discharge carbon dioxide, and cooler water can dissolve it more readily. Periodicity displayed in the data dovetails Milankovitch cycle activity with a precision not often seen in nature. You can do this real easily. It's an experiment I've done. Take 2 soda pop cans, okay? You put them on your kitchen table for a while, okay? And then you take one of them and put it in your refrigerator and leave the other one right on your kitchen table, okay? Next morning, you open up both of them. You put the cold one back in a remote corner of the refrigerator so it doesn't spill. You take the other one, just put it up in a cupboard where no one's gonna bother with it. And then the next day, you pour out the contents. Which one will have more carbon dioxide in it? The fizz. It'll be the colder one because it holds the carbon dioxide in it. The warm one can't. It releases it. And so no more fizz. Simple as that kitchen experiment is. It shows you why this is all nuts. So, this phenomenon is controlled by 3 different parameters that determine the aspect to which solar energy is received by the Earth. Together, they allow oceans to heat up or cool down. A warm oceanic regime will expel CO2, and as it cools, dissolution takes place. So that's why it happens. Now, what are these forcing mechanisms? Well, first of all, it's known that right now, earlier this month, the closest approach to the sun that the Earth has all year occurred back actually on January 1st. It'll never seem like it, but that's when it happens. It always happens in the first week of January, at least over our lifetimes. Now, the farthest point from the sun is near the 4th of July. It's hot then. So how does this happen? And it's a 6.8% differential in total solar energy reaching the surface. This is a significant amount. Well, it turns out that isn't always the case, because the perihelion point, the so-called the closest approach, actually circles around the orbit of the Earth, and it's a little over 20,000 years to get from one spot to the next. It's 20,000 years to do this. So it's not always going to be July and January for close approach. But what happens is, when you've had a regime of cold glaciation, once you get that point to precess to where it is at northern hemisphere summer, the glaciers shrink. Now, what did I say, just about 20,000 years? Well, that means 11,000 years ago it was coming into that position. What happened to the glaciers back 11 to 12,000 years ago? They vanished. Now, but that's not the only key to this. Why is it 110,000 years? That's because the Earth's orbit actually flexes between being more nearly circular to more eccentric. And so there's very little effect if the Earth's orbit is more circular. There isn't as dramatic of a difference. But when it stretches out to being more elliptical, then it can have a greater effect, and it can push the glaciers away. Now, that still wasn't enough to quite explain it all, but that is a period of 110,000 years. And if you saw that movie Inconvenient Truth, you saw that graph going back 650,000 years, well, divide that by 110,000, that's 6. That's 6 ups, 6 downs. Okay, and that's what we get. 6 periods of glaciation, 6 periods of interglacial, such as we're in now. And I'm going to scare you. The glacial periods are 10 times longer than the interglacials. They're coming back, folks.
Think we need to worry about it?
Probably not. But you know, imagine all this being bulldozed by glaciers that are 2,000 feet high. No more Willis Tower, no more bridges over the river, no more Wrigley Field, no more Merchandise Mart, no more Navy Pier. It's going to take a long time for this to happen, but remember, the Cubs still better hurry. Really. So we have the mechanism there. It's not because of the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide was simply following along. It wasn't being the cause. It was never the cause. Closer look at how a greenhouse actually works reveals that adding CO2, or almost any other heat-trapping gas, to Earth's atmosphere and expecting increased warming would be the equivalent of adding to the thickness of the glass of a typical greenhouse and expecting a higher internal temperature. If you go to a greenhouse, it's about an 1/8 inch thick glass. If you increase that thickness, it wouldn't increase the heat. Try a July day. You've been at a shopping center for about an hour and a half. Your car's in the middle of that parking lot. The sun's beating down on it. You open the door, and what is it? It's hotter inside because the car acted like a greenhouse. Do you think that it would be hotter if the glass in your car was thicker? No. It's already trapped. And in the Earth's atmosphere, that's pretty much what's already going on. Physics involve utterly rule out such a scenario. A mechanism of warming seas and releasing CO2 and cooling water dissolving CO2 in turn is provided by the dynamics of solar system mechanics. Cause and effect is reversed in that case, denying carbon dioxide's role in forcing temperature. An obvious boomerang effect. By the time several politicians and/or media correspondents have changed the discourse, any scientist noticing any divergence from data he and his associates may have been reported, to begin with, must now confront any number of these non-scientists and try to state they've been misunderstood. Wait a second here. That's not glamour. That's not headlines. That's not more money for me, politician, and make it look like I care. Right. Made more difficult because so many of the politicians, news reporters, will receive secondhand information so many times removed that certainty will have become so ingrained it will seem as if the scientists are contradicting their own selves when attempting to correct the situation. They'll look awkward trying to unglue it. Imagine trying to say, okay, after 13 years of being convinced that the CO2 and heat are perfectly matched and the CO2 is causing it, now you have to tell them, no, actually, it's the other way around. You can't do that to them. They won't accept that. They just don't. Smallest handful of individuals anywhere in the discussions asserting that there will be certainty will initiate a groundswell of many others eager to embrace that level of rhetoric. To fail to join that bandwagon would put anyone in an outcast role. You just are. Like me. I'm an outcast role. Rather easy to imagine how a scientist or a group of them may be cajoled by politicians or media personnel, and so many of the latter have communicated among themselves and convinced each other that the worst scenario must be what's happening. They gotta care more. They gotta look like they care more. They then refer back to the scientists and practically put words in their mouths by implying that they will receive no further attention or funding without verifying that Florida would become submerged in the not too distant future. And that's, by the way, where I'll be next week. Yeah. As I am almost every February, I go down there. And there's a 600 of us just take over a scout campground, 35 miles out of Key West. It's perfectly black, perfectly dark. And we just take the place over and enjoy the night sky for 6 months. One place. Looking from a different perspective, now who would want to study climate? Who would want to study global warming? Oh yeah, glamour. More to the point, who would want to fund either? Climate science, like so many other physical and natural sciences, is historically badly underfunded. Very few have a desire to fund anything that on the face of it seems very mundane. But they're being fooled considerably here, in a very strange way. Any potential calamity in the mix, such as anthropogenic global warming, inspires all kinds of interest, and among more than a few without scruples or proper scientific background. They don't know how to do it. It gets worse. It gets worse. In fact, the prescription for any perceived problem happens to involve policy-making decisions, especially implying control, will whet the appetite of the politicians. It would appear as if they care. Foremost among these has been former Vice President Gore, student of a college professor, a guy named Roger Revelle, known as a longtime advocate of the concept of enhanced levels of greenhouse gases being responsible for a warming atmosphere. By the way, a number of years ago he died, and the last few months before he died, he was telling people, no, it really isn't true. But you don't hear that. You don't hear that. So entranced with the former vice president with this hypothesis, he'd written about it, written books. There's a new one out like yesterday. He made a priority as the Clinton-Gore administration took over in '93. According to many reports, anyone in the energy or environmental departments at that time would publish material contrary to his way of thinking or vanished. Word spread, you better toe the line or you are next at the exit door. Anyone who aspired for positions in those bureaucracies, they knew they had to toe the line or they weren't getting in. Next administration, that was George W. Bush, apparently had to make do inheriting many who had been inheritance of the global warming doctrine. At that time, climate science had become so saturated with the glamour of man-made global warming that personnel who had not been affected by it were very scarce in government circles. It's become apparent that many well-heeled contributors to researchers have ties to Al Gore and his political interests. They fund them to look for global warming rather than for climate science. Never mistake as to the researchers finding anything else. so implicit that continued funding demands each of them bring back evidence of a positive result. Claims of energy companies paying exorbitant fees to skeptics may be true, but are next to nothing in comparison to amounts received by the inheritances. See? Look at all I get from the office. Oh, do I have my change? I can hear you, okay. It's that way. Scientists being funded to find global warming or any evidence thereof would, in publishing their findings, reinforce beliefs held by various interests, having no incentive to believe otherwise. They just don't. They want to believe it. Extra headlines. Extra means of being able to say they care. Right. Usually assume that scientists, for the most part, are disciplined enough to avoid problems such as these. But even if they were, all the rest of them are not held to those same standards. Result can be chaos and demand to adhere to a stringent doctrine. Global warming is true. There's a consensus. It must be. It's incontrovertible. Current trend of so many of the wealthy research contributors being connected to a certain political party, ALs, may also be worth investigating. It is very apparent that many of the politically connected adherents absolutely could not stand it if they were feeling compelled to admit that their adversaries were correct. This gives them plenty of incentive to fail to acknowledge what must be right. Can you imagine, somebody like Senator Boxer on the Senate Science Committee having to admit that all those Republicans in the committee for all those years were right? You said, imagine that. Won't happen. Disadvantage that skeptical researchers have is that there's almost no one to fund them except the energy companies, which wind up with that stigma of vested interest whenever they do. Okay. That shoe may fit the other foot better. Energy companies, together with a wide variety of industries, have moved, or appear to move, toward an embracing of the whole green concept. Oh, we're in it. I really like the Pew Research Center. They're all in on us. And the Pew Research Center was founded by the people who have founded and have run Sun Oil Company, Sunoco. Well, we think it's right, yeah. Now, like I said, it gets worse. Here we go. Been several methods of retarding global warmth proposed that involve schemes to block the sun. I kid you not. Sometimes this is called geoengineering. This is no kidding. Block the sun. Among the most grandiose of these would be placed at a well-known gravitational balance point, which, by the way, is already occupied, located just over 1 million miles closer to the sun from the Earth. A shielding device prodigious enough to block sunlight to an extent deemed equal to the speculated enhanced greenhouse. There is already a spacecraft there. It's called SOHO, the Solar Orbiting and Heliographic Observatory, SOHO. And the reason why it can hang at that position is, even though it's closer to the sun, you'd expect it to go faster, because the Earth is there just 1 million miles farther out. Earth's gravity keeps it tagging along with itself. The same thing, by the way, will happen 1 million miles farther out from the Earth. These are called Lagrange balancing points, and the city of Lagrange was named for the guy who found this out. But anyway, the new space telescope, the Webb telescope, is actually going to be at that position farther out when they finally launch it, supposedly 5 years from now, which is about the time that the Hubble Space Telescope's expected lifetime, probably will come to an end. Although we're hoping that it continues farther beyond that. Okay. So yeah, block the sun. Okay. There's another way of doing this too, by the way. Just pretend you're a big volcano and exude a whole bunch of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Go up there with a lot of military aircraft and just spew it out. Pretend you're a volcano. Yeah, they dream these things up. Now, wouldn't make any difference whether warming is happening or not. increased consumption of winter fuel compared to the amount if such a device was not in place would be consumed. You'd have cooler winters. You'd have colder winters. And that was whether there's going to be global warming or not, compared to whether the device was not in place. So guess what? Okay, if natural terrestrial cooling is taking place, such as has occurred many hundreds of times in the geologic record that we know of, crisis proportions could be reached. What if we have another eruption such as Mount Tambora back in 1850? The following year was called the year without a summer, or 1800 and froze to death. New England had no growing season that year. There were so many volcanic aerosols in the atmosphere, they had snow in June. And by the way, for historical purposes, it was that drove so many of them to the Midwest. And all of a sudden, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois become states just a couple years later, because the New Englanders were pushed out and came here. But yeah, you could reach crisis proportions if that happens. Such a device would actually take a prohibitive amount of time to construct, as well as being inordinately difficult and costly. Nonetheless, energy companies may envision eventual profits emanating from such a scheme, so they're in on this. Close to 2009, there had been a revelation, and much of it involves a lack of revelation. It's called ClimateGate. Anyone familiar with it? All right. It has to do with a large collection of emails among scientists linked closely to the global warming movement, which made claims they were deliberately manipulating data and cooking the figures. Arjun Mosaman is in the climate research unit of East Anglia University, that's near London, the foremost of the so-called climate change advocacy institutions. Many of them were sent to and from various academic centers, which were forced to at least put on the appearance of conducting investigations. But these inquiries were too internal to be reliable. Thorough investigation requiring many scientists and other witnesses under oath will no doubt reveal a prolonged conspiracy not only to camouflage and mask over genuine data, but the carefully planned manipulation of computer climate modeling. The lack of revelation is the deliberate concealment of the situation by organs of the mass media. You didn't hear about it. Mass media didn't want to, they published the Pentagon Papers. They published this. Just been complicit with just about everything politicians of the global warming persuasion have dreamt up. They just are. They're complicit. Far too many institutions and industries have been ensnared in the global warming scam to allow an easy withdrawal from the gospel has become. The amount of irretrievable resources invested, while paling still in comparison to national debt, we know what that's at, can provide justification to continue to hide evidence to the contrary. They've got to hide it. Many have been convinced investors that taking part will no doubt have more answering to do than they would wish, likely far more. Incentive to hide what has been going on will be staggering. Now this is pretty completely speculative on my part, but I'm hoping this doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. Substantial influx of green industry. Now, if people believe what's going on in those ClimateGate emails, it will soon lose its value and precipitate collapse not seen since 1929. The global warming has become such a widely accepted concept when combined with the fact that there appears to be no reliable source for climate science per se, suggests that the political connection has become exceedingly dangerous. In other words, if all of a sudden it's said that, oh no, it isn't true, how much do you think climate scientists would get in funding? Right, zero. The inference is that many of the major contributors to science have become affiliated with a political party, often perceived as the advocates of the less well-to-do, as opposed to a party so often tagged with being the ones that support the wealthy. Yet the party so often portrayed as a supporter of the downtrodden has a lion's share of the venture capital required to fund research. They have become the party of the rich. Their dominance of the full philanthropical scene has demonstrated that. They have all the money. They just do. Given their very suspect agenda, which appears to consist of compromising our nation's security and our prosperity, the likelihood of anyone funding science in general and the study of climate in particular will be nearly vanishing after global warming adherence is proven groundless. The reputation of science will be just set back immeasurably. I have no idea how far back it will be set. In January 2010, a confession made by an IPCC administrator about a misleading statement concerning Himalayan glaciers that was included in their report established that it was made to entice leaders of Asian nations affected by Himalayan meltwater to become more aggressive in pushing political agenda. Now, you may think, well, this is scientists trying to do the politicians in. Periodically, but the scientists misleading politicians and journalists. In fact, it underscores the latter's culpability on the topic. It's the journalists and politicians. They have long claimed to have espoused the content of the report, but if in fact they have noticed that those glaciers would be melted away by the year 2035, which is what this said, those Himalayan glaciers, then they would have either one of two shortcomings. One would be they actually believe that glaciers of that mass could be melted away on any conceivable time scale, especially at the pace of the wildest expectations of global temperature increase up until that year, or even centuries beyond, because the mass is that big. The other would be they did understand how fatally naive such an assertion would be, and were too afraid to challenge in the face of so many colleagues who wondered why anyone should be so mistrusting of such an authoritative document as an IPCC report. Right? You can't challenge it. And then another twist to it. As the river flowing from the Himalayas do not rely on melting glaciers, but rather from snowmelt. So disappearing glaciers might not even have any net impact at all. It's that way. Therefore, no longer very difficult to understand. Many scientists and mathematicians at elite academic institutions feel frustrated they cannot publish their strong reservations about global warming being caused by human activity. Their institutions are being supported financially in vast amounts by well-heeled contributors who are demanding adherence to the document itself. I've witnessed this. Prior to that debate, that campus debate I did at Triton 6 years ago, I was announcing that it was going to take place. And people from the astrophysics department at a big university came up to me and said, well, thank God there's somebody who's figuring this out. Because they'd already figured it out. But he said, we just can't publish that. The contributors are too well-heeled, they're too in line with it, they're too politically connected. We can't say a word. We are hushed. They're being censored. They can't say anything. If you ever go into the internet and find where the contrarians are, they're all retired. They don't have to rely on the gravy train. They're all retired. And I'm close to retirement myself. Too much risk involved in funding them, since there are otherwise scarce alternatives for funding. Where else do you get the funding? The venture capital is tied up in contributors with a particular political motivation tied to the political party most often associated with a social engineering agenda. They don't do the space program. Oh, they used to. Remember a guy named Jack Kennedy. There's too much risk involved in offending them, since they're otherwise scarce. Yeah, okay. An alternative method to alleviate climate concerns, and it does involve the space program, not blocking the sun, but using technology available for the last 3 decades. How do you do that? Anyone have any idea? Space-based solar power stations. Turning the moon established bases there that would allow for the construction of solar power stations whose energy would be beamed back using conventional microwaves to specialized receivers on Earth is a superior option. Like I said, for the last 3 decades, we've had the ability to do this. Now, see, the moon never gets clouded up. Solar power is there all the time. And completely unattenuated. The only time you have to worry is when the moon falls into the Earth's shadow, a lunar eclipse. but there's ways around that. Okay. Now, how do you beam it back? Actually, beam it back with the very same microwaves that handle these things. But you're doing a little bit more concentrated form. And it's amazing, when I first learned about this, which was more than 30 years ago, what you would have is an array of wiring, covering about 160 acres, typical farm, okay, about 20 feet up. The microwave energy would be captured by this array, sent to a receiving facility, and the farmer can continue to do his work underneath it all. They have made studies on honeybees, subjected over and over and over again to these microwaves. There's no effect on their biology. And despite the scare stories of these things causing cancer or something, I don't have cancer. It'd be less expensive, easier, and much less time consuming than an Earth Sun Lagrange point station. It would serve to eliminate 40% or more of our nation's carbon emissions. So if global warming is actually underway, then it would be remedial. If global warming is not happening, then it would be a benign effect that would alleviate a considerable amount of our dependency on foreign fuel sources, with many other beneficial, even if unintended, consequences. This cannot be emphasized enough. It would also be an answer if terrestrial cooling is underway. Why is it not considered an option? The space agency has been the favorite target of cost cutters. I forgot to bring the images of these guys. Walter Mondale, Bill Proxmire, Frank Church, Barney Frank. But anyway, sorry about that. Publicity-seeking type in government circles for all too long. Popular media for many decades has managed to report costs for space projects without comparing the expense of other agencies. Now I'm going to compare them for you. Those moments when publicity for the space program was forthcoming were almost always when mishaps occurred, such as the Hubble Space Telescope optical defect, along with the losses of Skylab, Challenger, and Columbia. On many occasions, of course, when the media have reported on highly successful missions, but never without reporting the cost, of course. I just want to put a little plug here for the Chicago Astronomical Society. Hubble Space Telescope is named for a former member of the Chicago Astronomical Society. Edwin Hubble was, in fact, a member back about a century ago, along with the fellow who was his mentor, George Ellery Hale, first director of Yerkes Observatory and the builder of both the Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar telescopes. They were both members of the CAS. So, none of these events, whether success or failure, did the media fail to inform us what the costs of these projects were. Even this last one, this opportunity, new rover on Mars. They tell you what the cost of these projects are. It always sounds like a ton. Tell you how much NASA spends each year. Almost breathtaking account by the impediments NASA has been confronted with, all while possessing the ability to provide the virtual limitless, inexpensive energy which we have been striving to achieve for so long now. The frequency with which NASA has been on the cutting edge, that is targeted by politicians and rival interest groups and their agencies for budget shopping, beyond estimate, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Apollo era when we did land men on the moon. NASA has been incessantly accused of spending money for space projects when, you always get this refrain, it's always been better down here on Earth. The impression was always left that there was no return for the investment, and the dividends left over from not spending on space projects would affect virtually everyone in the audience in a beneficial way. Furthermore, the intention was to leave everyone thinking that it was exorbitant and interfering with more legitimate interests. Maybe we should rethink this. Even at the onset of the Apollo project to land men on the moon, there were ominous signs. While commencing the building of the great Saturn V moon rocket, NASA's annual budget was about $5.25 billion. that point, healthcare entitlements were already $33 billion. Putting NASA's share of the combined budgets at just about 14%. $4.25 billion with $33 billion. NASA's about 14%. Already the socialized medicine lobby was complaining about losing out to the bloated space agency. Okay. Fast forwarding to 1993. Still griping year after year about NASA's billions, that socialized medicine lobby was still pouring it on. Space agency allocation reached $14.5 billion. Given the anguish expressed by the socialized medicine apologists, one would think that 93's healthcare entitlements would have been so encroached upon by NASA, it would have been hard pressed to reach $24 billion. What do you think it was, 1993? $770 billion. Space pursues not even 2% of the combined budget at this point. It was the following year, though. Remember I said this gets worse? Budgetary controversy swirling through the Capitol, government shutdowns, all that other stuff. And it's the true eye-opener. NASA went cut to $14 billion, but fraud, just fraud, in Medicare and Medicaid had reached $16 billion. Just fraud. The socialized medicine lobby, still whining about NASA, then started announcing how small of a percentage of the total of the fraud was. So it's okay. It's more than NASA's budget. They complain about NASA, but the fraud's okay. This time to 98, and now in my college of page class, I decided to do this. Try to see whether there was any way we could get NASA to be 14% of something in that national largesse. Anything. By that time, its budget was down to $13 billion. So if tied with anything close to about $85 billion, it'd be about 14%. Okay, let's see what's there in the federal largesse. Adding together the amount spent by the nation on illicit narcotics that year, $38 billion. The amount spent by the government fighting illicit narcotics, another $37 billion. That's $75 billion. And the amount spent on pornography, another $10 billion. That brings us to $85 billion. That's what we would have done. NASA was 14%. Great. Isn't that just spectacular? The figure $85 billion was prominent that year for royalties for another reason. In those days prior to the breakup of Microsoft, that was Bill Gates' personal fortune. You know, NASA's budget's 14% in that combination. Special irony there in that without the amazing technological breakthroughs in electronic circuitry miniaturization generated by America's lunar missions, software developed by Bill Gates and others would have been stifled. And we wouldn't have these things. The immeasurable global impact of what had been wrought as a result would not have happened. The other obvious irony is that had NASA received just 10% of the socialized medicine budget for the last 20 years, there would already be lunar-based solar power stations coming into operation, having the effect of accomplishing the environmentalist supposed goal of a 40% drop in greenhouse gas emissions. But you have to toe the line to this particular party, don't you? Because lunar-based stations would be providing limitless electricity, they could provide enough for hydrolysis, the only method of efficiently releasing hydrogen for use as a fuel. Most motor vehicles could then run on hydrogen, cutting back even further on emissions, totally eliminating the danger of the highly toxic pollutant carbon monoxide and the onus of having to import foreign resources, energy resources, would be removed. You wouldn't have to. If the trends from 1993 to 1998 had been extrapolated to 2006, then NASA's budget would have been exceeded by both pornography and Bill Gates' annual income. And the social program advocates would still have been complaining about all that money being spent out there instead of more down-to-earth concerns, and they would have a voice because the media is complicit. Our nation's space agency has been a source of up to 90% of our current prosperity, or whatever prosperity we have left. And when closely examined, it's found that advances in everyday technology, not GPS, have contributed to an incalculable windfall that our country has benefited from, so have other places around the globe. The derived advances in medical technology, which have saved thousands of lives and alleviated considerable suffering. We're talking about pacemakers, MRIs, CAT scans, improved dialysis, all of these things, because we landed men on the moon. Weather forecasting has improved dramatically. Aviation and farming interests especially. Military surveillance, communication, exploratory science, all many orders of magnitude better on account of the space program. Application of the computer powers generated can no longer be estimated. There are far too many to count, and the benefits derived too great to be assessed. All right, now, let's hit it even harder. 2009, NASA was receiving $18 billion, but fraud in Medicare was $60 billion. Fraud in Medicaid was another $60 billion, as was the fraud in the Bernie Madoff scandal. So you add the three together, three times $60 billion, that's $180 billion. Compared to NASA, $18 billion, 10% of fraud. By the end of 2013, this year, it will be a pittance compared to the ClimateGate scandal. Almost tragically, otherwise willing politicians over the past few decades have shown little inclination for attempting to overcome the constant undercurrent that funding for space endeavors is wasted out there. On that particular point, I want to just digress slightly. The institution I work at Triton College is named for, like I said, the last Apollo astronaut to walk on the moon. He was joined up there with a fellow named Jack Schmitt, who was the only trained scientist on any of the moon missions, a geologist. He was running. He ran for Senate in New Mexico, and he won the first time around. But his opponent brought out this space endeavors wasting all our money out there. When he came up for re-election, he lost, naturally. That easily uttered soundbite refrain at election time has impeded many attempts to demonstrate the worthiness of cutting-edge space pioneering to an electorate deprived of pertinent information. You don't hear about it. Past 45, we take these things for granted. Don't we take these things for granted? These things for granted? Yeah, we do. There's never been the 60 votes required in the Senate to put in motion a manned space mission effort that would be on a sufficiently massive scale to ensure that exploration would be a truly open-ended enterprise the way apparently Jack Kennedy intended it to be. If you listen to his speeches closely, he wanted not just to go to the moon and back, he wanted that just to be a stepping stone. Okay, now, so it gets worse. Night after the great Christmas tsunami of 2004, a CNN anchorman interviewing a well-known science promoter asked him if it had been caused by global warming. A tsunami caused by an earthquake that was 50 miles underneath the ocean. There was several thousand feet of ocean above that. And then you have the atmosphere, which has been supposedly warmed up by a few tenths of a degree. That's what caused it. Gets worse. Spokesman for Greenpeace and Friends have also linked it to global warming. So did a major insurance company. I think they're called Munich Re. Anxious to target industries allegedly responsible for CO2 emissions with lawsuits in the event they were compelled to provide adjustment for atmospheric or even some other natural disaster damages. I mean, this is nuts. This is totally nuts. But it gets worse. Special Green issue of April 2007. 2 separate articles in Newsweek. Thank God it's gone. It was inferred that the tsunami was a result of global warming. Is it possible that high-profile members of the major media have scientific illiteracy to a preposterous extent? Are you going to be misled, alarmingly misled by such egregious exaggeration? That's what they're trying to do. Yeah. See, they get they're all the scientific journals. See there on the middle right, what Obama must do about the climate crisis. Yeah. Right. Here's this big scientific journal, right? Yeah. Okay. They're all in on it. And that's the most recent issue item. Despite the answers being a resounding yes in both cases, no scientists have published in the aftermath of these eerily ignorant assertions. Not only pointing out that they were wrong, but how many orders of magnitude they removed from reality. genuine scientists would have rushed to rebut everything, but they were never heard from. Now, if these proponents were among those trying to correct the errors, they would have been turned away by publishers not willing to forego the opportunity to just plain use alarming tactics at every opportunity. Given the mentality of the situation, would unlikely that global warming proponents in the scientific community would have even tried to persuade the editors to publish a retraction, not just because they would have been trying to sound the alarm themselves, to keep that heightened sense of alarm, would have certainly sensed that it would have been useless to try to persuade editors to publish retractions. The publishers simply would have said, okay, they're doing the scientists a favor by heightening emotional appeal. There's certainly nothing wrong with that. Whether there was any attempt or not, the collusion here is obvious between the global warming adherents and the major media. What they lead people to believe is that they are do peer review, but it's more like peer pressure. Force them to work to put fear ahead of science. The most distressing feature of the global warming movement is the fact that they have cried wolf, thereby jeopardizing the reputation of science in general and atmospheric science in particular. Throughout the last quarter century, when the alleged climate crisis has been in headlines, there has been left the impression that it is either or situation. It's either happening or the atmosphere will remain the same. I was left with that impression. Oh, leave it alone, the earth will just stay the same. Roll my eyes. When attempting to study a phenomenon from a scientific standpoint, all possibilities must be included. And in this case, the chance that through natural forces, global cooling could be in our immediate future. Then that also must be considered. The climate change due to human activity advocates totally ignore this vital scenario. Could we be cooling? Remember that Milankovitch forcing? Okay, we'll get to it in a minute. Yeah, I'm mad. I am. I'm just plain mad. To give you, when we go through the rock record to see periods of glaciation versus interglacial periods, interglacial periods on average last 11,000 years. The last glacial advance here was 11,700 years ago. Now, I guess that's now, I just want to give a little background on those climate gate emails. In one of them, they're trying to say, okay, well, we're going to use this particular trick by tacking on temperatures that we have from thermometers, usually in urban heat islands, to all the record we have going back 1,000 years, based on tree ring proxy data. Well, tree rings fluctuate on the basis of 5 different mechanisms, not just whether there's warmth or not. And they don't operate during winter. So you're not getting a real good evaluation there at all. But in the meanwhile, when they looked at the tree rings up until current date, they realized that instead of going up in temperature, there seemed to be a slight downward trend. So we have to hide the decline. Yeah. But that tree ring proxy data was used to suppress what the original report had said, which was that back 1,000 years ago when the Vikings were on the rampage and doing their explorations, it was warmer than it is now. There was Scottish wine. There were vineyards on Newfoundland. In fact, the Vikings called it Vinland because there were vines. Greenland was self-sufficient because they could farm. There were olive groves in Germany. Can't get that now. None of that would happen now. So it was warmer back then. But they've been trying to hide that. That's the real hide the decline. If you ever hear the expression hide the decline from the emails, that's what they were hiding. And that's what the original researchers in the 1990 report were saying. But they had to suppress that in the subsequent reports because they couldn't make it look like it was warmer 1,000 years ago. What's interesting is in between there was what we call the Little Ice Age. And was very interesting in that about a century ago, a fellow who happened to be the director of the Royal Greenwich Observatory, where the timekeeping is maintained for worldwide, and the coordinate system is kept. The director was a fellow named Edward Walter Maunder. And he researched the time of the Little Ice Age, and of course back then they were having frost festivals on the Thames River. Thames River flows all the time, winter, summer, spring, autumn, and it has ever since then, but there were 70 different winters where they could actually ice skate, have frost festivals. What was happening? Well, you notice that the astronomers at the time had been trying to find these mysterious spots on the sun that Galileo had first tracked down, sunspots. And even though these astronomers who were looking for them had discovered the nature of Saturn's rings, and also some of Saturn's satellites go around Saturn's moons, they were not noticing any sunspots. They certainly had the telescopic capability of doing it. The resolution was there. But there were very, very few sunspots during that interlude between, I believe, 1645 and 1715. Now, if you look at the literature of the time, 1715, 1716, it was noted in the journals that the elderly were noticing a glow in the nighttime sky that they hadn't seen since their extreme youth. The aurora borealis was back. And we know, in fact, that that is a magnetic effect from the sun that causes that. I'm happy to say it was that same George Ellery Hale, who built Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar telescopes, who was the one who, in fact, discovered that sunspots are giant magnetic storms on the sun. It was he who did it. It was in 1908. Anyway, so if there was very little magnetic activity on the sun, then maybe that was a cause of the Little Ice Age. Maybe the sun's overall radiance was down. And it's very interesting what's happened subsequently to that. It had been known since the 1930s, physicists had noticed that there must be some way that carbon-14 happens. Carbon-14 is radioactive, and it has a half-life of about 30,000 years, if I remember right. So it disappears over a comparatively short geological span of time. So it has to be regenerated somehow. But there's no terrestrial method of doing that. It's cosmic rays. They're a daughter product of cosmic rays. Now, botanists came to the rescue here by taking tree ring samples of what are called bristlecone pines and other trees that live many millennia, well, actually many centuries at least, and over a couple of millennia. They noticed that the levels of carbon-14 in those tree rings from the Little Ice Age was higher than either the medieval optimum when the Vikings were around or current time. So they were revealing that in fact the sun's magnetic activity was acting as a shield, both when the Vikings were exploring and now, explaining the warmth of those times. During the Little Ice Age, there wasn't that much magnetic activity, and therefore there was less solar radiance. Now, getting back to Mount Wilson Observatory, back during the 1980s, there was a fellow there who was studying stars like the sun. The reason for that, in particular, was that the capability of finding extrasolar planets going around other stars was coming into being. And of course, you're going to want to check out sun-like stars because that's the most likely place you're going to find Earth-like planets. So the reasoning went. Well, anyway, he passed this study along to his colleagues, and using what are called polarizing filters, rather than just look through the eyepiece of the telescope to see what's there, they were able to determine the amount of magnetic effect of these stars, because the polarizer filter would change the output depending on how you oriented the polarizer. So they noticed that some stars were strongly magnetic and some were not. And those that were not strongly magnetic were about 1 to 2% less luminous than those that were magnetically strong. Now, and this was just in the visible spectrum. In the ultraviolet spectrum, more than 35% drops were noted among those stars that were not magnetically active. And ultraviolet light is what empowers the upper part of the atmosphere to become warm. That's why when you go up in the troposphere, the temperature drops with altitude. When you hit the stratosphere, it reverses itself and the temperature rises with altitude. That's because the ultraviolet light's hitting the top of the stratosphere. That's, by the way, where ozone is formed. And if ozone wasn't forming, we'd be dead. So, now, there was another line of evidence involved here too. Not only were the tree rings showing the carbon-14, ice cores were also showing beryllium-10, which is a daughter product of boron-10 being hit by cosmic rays. And it's a higher concentration, again, in the Little Ice Age, where those parts of the cores were compared to either before or since. So you had another line of evidence. Another line of evidence, this is a very interesting one. Little Ice Age produced the famous stringed instruments of Cremona, Italy. I'm sure you've heard of Amati and Stradivari and Guarneri instruments. They couldn't be made after that because the trees were not subjected to Little Ice Age climate conditions. And that's not dense enough to do it. So yet another line of evidence. The Earth's atmosphere is changing without our help. But you wouldn't believe that, would you? Any questions? Yes?
Are there any parts of the IPC reports that we can always accept as true? It sounds like some parts of them are true, some parts of them have been fudged. I mean, how reliable as a whole are those IPCC reports?
Well, some of the consequences of warming will show up. And they do have, yeah, it will happen. But they're trying to say that it's happening because it couldn't happen otherwise. Natural warming can't be happening. That's what they're saying. But the warming will happen if in fact it is natural. And as a result, you'll see some of those effects happening. But it just gets weirder and weirder because we know that from the literature, as the Earth changed from the medieval optimum to the Little Ice Age, the climate actually got stormier. So as it getting cooler, it was getting stormier. You hear these people, they say, if it gets warmer, it gets stormier. Well, that's not true. In fact, back in 1988, again explaining this drought, again that contrast between the high latitudes, which are more affected, versus the lower latitudes less affected, that you would have less contrast and therefore less storminess. Although hurricanes would be stronger because they rely strictly on a thermal gradient, not fluid dynamics, such as the storm we're having right now. If you look at Tom Skilling's jet stream patterns, you'll notice that there's a whopping strong jet stream whipping itself into this regime here. And it's coming out from deep Gulf moisture too. So it's both strong and directional for big storm. That's the way the dynamics take place. But a hurricane or any other tropical storm is strictly a thermally generated system that creates its own fluid dynamics. That's how a tropical storm will work. It does not rely on fluid dynamics. Now, here's the interesting situation. Back in the early 90s, there was this perfect storm. Okay, maybe you've heard about it or saw the movie, The Perfect Storm. Well, actually, that was a Hurricane Sandy that just stayed out at sea. That's all it was. Hurricane Sandy just came ashore and became a big event. So same thing going on. In that case, the dynamics actually converged and combined to create a real superstorm, or Frankenstorm they were calling it, in fact. So that's why that happened. So take it with a grain of salt when you hear about this global warming. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
And may the force be with you. Thanks again, folks, for coming out on such a lousy night. Really.